money, you might as well populate space.
Making it like a tourist thing,
Yeah, making more money.
like $10,000 an orbit or something.
Well, there's already at least one company that it does some kind of something like that. They'll take you up to where you can see the darkness and you can be weightless, and then comes back down. And I don't know.
Russia, right?
I don't know, but it's some crazy expensive. I mean, they've been doing it for years. So.
I read about that. I can't remember what country it's in.
And I understand there's another company that will send your ashes
That's
up,
just
up to
creepy.
just,
Or they tell
Sure
you,
they do.
how do you know that they actually do that?
Right?
It's the same about naming stars after you, really, or you buy a star you can name. Who owns those? I mean, I want to see the copyright or whatever you trademark.
Right, how
It's
many
a cool idea, but
how many people did they sell that star to?
Yeah.
and if they tell you they planted a flag on it, wait a minute. What kind of flag was it? Aluminum? I mean.
Up in North Pole, you can buy 1 square inch of Alaska property and give you a title and everything.
1 square inch.
1 square inch.
Whew. You better jump on
Real estate
that.
tycoons right there.
Yeah.
Want to know how much that 1 square inch costs?
Right.
Even when you're getting ashes back from like your pet, we had one dog that had titanium hips, which you spend all that money. I mean, that was a lot of money on a dog. Talk about feeling bad. There are poor kids out there that need an operation, and we spend that money on a Rottweiler, right? Because of their hips, right? And then it died at like 6 years old of weird liver cancer that Rottweilers get. And so it was really just a young dog for us, and it died. So we got the ashes back, and I opened the can and looked, and there were no hips, and I was curious what they looked like. And there were no titanium hips in the ashes, and I thought, no, wait a minute. So I called the vet, and I said, there were no titanium hips, and they said, oh, you must have gotten the wrong one, and lo and behold, the next can of ashes we got had 2 titanium hips in them. And
Well, that's funny. I had a titanium rod in my femur that I had removed. My brother framed it for me, and it's really interesting.
Keepsake.
Yeah. Well, it was kind of an ordeal, but
Yeah.
sounds like it wasn't much fun.
when I've cremated animals before, I was given the choice to either have them mixed with other animals and have
And then you get a
or
portion of
pay
the
a little bit more and make sure that you get your own.
a private cremation versus
Yeah. And it's not considerably more, but it's not cheap. Either way, it's not cheap, but, yeah.
What happened to just burying them in the backyard?
That's what we used to do. But then
Yeah.
again, I grew up in the Butte. You don't really.
I went to Palmer High School.
Anything happens in the Butte, and
Yeah,
they just
there's
don't talk about
places
that.
where you can spread them. Like there's in the one cemetery downtown, there's a flower garden where it's for spreading ashes there.
Oh, really?
But we took Grandpa, we brought his ashes back from Philadelphia in the plane, and it was, what are we going to do with this? We didn't want to put it in the luggage.
Taking those titanium
So-
hits through security must have been interesting.
Well, it wasn't that. We didn't have
Actually,
that.
titanium doesn't set off the metal detectors.
Uh,
And even with the full body camera thing that they have, my underwire bra would, but not my leg. So,
Huh.
maybe that's too much information. But still, it's,
My wife has the same issue. We go through. However, when we brought Grandpa back, it actually had a label on it saying what it was, so that it would go through no problem. And then they insisted on putting him up in the overhead. So he flew up in the overhead.
Well, I do plan, and this may be a different philosophical topic, but I plan to put my animals' ashes in with mine when I pass.
I've heard of people doing that.
Yeah.
I wanna be planted under a tree. Figure that.
Well, you better buy.
That's pretty hard to get the tree.
Let's say-
Much room left when you pass.
Well, and you gotta,
It is
there's
rough on the
only
tree
a
though
few
for them to
areas
lift it
that'll
up
actually
and
let
put
you
you
do
in the.
that, because there's so many regulations.
Yeah.
And even the cemetery in Anchorage, they, I mean, a lot of the empty spaces you see are already purchased.
Oh, no, I don't wanna be, I wanna be like out
Oh,
in the
absolutely.
weeds, not cremated, not embalmed, just
In the middle of
in the
nowhere.
ground with a tree on me.
We got lots of those.
Back to the dirt, huh?
We got lots of those.
The sign that says the police know.
I'll be dead, so whatever you do, that's on you.
Well, the
It's cute you think you're going first,
Right.
statistically, not a good chance of that.
I know,
especially with my.
he
lady.
loves to tell me that.
But the two did I have the quiz questions right from last week? The one was, has the pill been one of the factors in the decrease of
Mhm.
Americans in marriages? And the other was, do you think it would be good if everything that happens was recorded? So,
And there's no real deadline on those as long as we do them.
Right,
Because I didn't get mine in.
Yeah, I was about to say, I started writing mine,
Yeah,
but
me too. I
work
thought about
kinda
it.
got in my way.
yeah, those are, actually, the deadline is when I have to turn in grades, because that's when I look at your whole collection of your emails and get a sense of, did you reply to them all? I joke that I weigh them.
And is it preferable for you to have us do both on one email, or?
It doesn't matter.
It doesn't matter, okay.
Towards the end of the semester, I'll have people sending all of them in one. And the thing is, by that time, it's like, I'm not gonna probably reply to each of them. Because, it's like, but it's too much to sit there and try to reply to 30 questions, basically.
Why don't you put mine on the blog?
Yes, some people put them on the blog, which is an interesting way of doing it, because then you can, oh, what did I do?
When you say the pill, are you talking about birth control?
Yep.
Yes,
Okay.
Yeah,
Alright.
I know the time is not.
were you here for that discussion?
No, I still, I started YouTubing it, but I haven't finished it.
Oh, I'm not sure if it went all the way through, because it did stop partway. But that's actually one of those really odd and surprising things that I don't hear discussed in other places or even in the news. But it seems uncontroversial that it's a real issue, and that is that the pill mimics that you're pregnant, right? It convinces your body that you're pregnant by giving you the hormones from pregnant horses. So it's
So your body doesn't have a period,
so you don't have a period.
really say.
But the discovery they made in '98, which I believe it's about as verified as you can make it, is that animals can sense that their mates, whether they're fertile or not, through the pheromones that they communicate. And so if they're fertile, the pheromones communicate that they are, and that, I guess the most famous animals, domestic animals, are, the female dogs. You have, all the neighborhood dogs come if they're, right? So a lot of people don't want the mess, so they leave the dog in the house during that time period or something, right? But we don't think of, that as a problem with human women, because typically you don't have, a whole bunch of men coming from like Juneau where is she? You know, you know, that's a joke. You know,
I was trying to do it.
sorry, I know my
So
sense
you're
of
s-
humor is just,
So you're saying since women on the pill wouldn't have like that peak of hormones that.
they're not gonna be as attractive subconsciously to the males. And it could be, and in fact, it turns out it seems to be worse because subliminally the males are aware that she is already pregnant with a horse. Which makes her even less attractive, you know, because it means she's been fooling around with a horse.
So I guess it's
Subliminally,
supposed
you
to
know,
be
it's not
guy.
like, pardon?
So I guess that depends on the guy's perspective, but.
Well, you know, it's not
Out
like
there.
guys overtly are aware of
Mm.
this. This is subliminal, biochemical. But so, if you're curious, the book where I first read about that was years ago, and there's lots of other stuff out, but that was in the end of, or the decline of males, which you can still find in the library, I'm sure.
Men are welcome to invent their own birth control.
Making it for women.
We did, it's called a condom.
Yeah, but then you have people, it doesn't feel the same, but I don't want condoms. That weaver's taking No, you didn't beat guys, but.
How what?
That's what they say.
So that was the one stimulus for that question, because apparently the strength of marriages declined from like the 50s and kept declining. So the more the pill was being used, the more marriages declined.
No more shotgun weddings.
Well, there was also psychological
Yeah.
effects, you know, if, you know, men thought, well, if you're pregnant, it's your fault, because you could have had a pill. Why didn't you take the pill? It's not my fault. Whereas before, if you were pregnant and it was unplanned, it's still my fault. So theoretically, you know, the feminists were thrilled that the pill liberated women, you know, from being forced to have children.
Still takes two to tango.
But in a sense, it also liberated males from feeling guilty over
The sole responsibility for it.
Right,
Yeah.
right. So there's all, and that's just two. I mean, there's all kinds of other issues too. We've moved more into a consumer-based, selfish, self-centered. You know, what's the main reason I'm alive and making money is so that I can be happy. Why do I want to spend my money on helping other people be happy, like my family, right? You know, that. You know,
But
so-
I feel like there's so much else going on in society, you can't just say, oh, the pill, like.
Yeah, it's
there's-
Like, it
there's
might have
like
been a
pull
quite a
factor,
big
but-
conclusion off of one correlation.
Yeah.
It could have been a
And this
contributing
is-
factor,
this
but maybe
isn't-
not.
This isn't the kind of correlation that you can absolutely prove.
Mhm.
It's a statistical relationship that actually changes, so how can you be sure? It's just a hypothesis, but, and by the way, it's the kind of hypothesis people who are against the pill and against contraception latch onto and say, aha, see, God would not have approved, or whatever, right? So that's kind of interesting. But
Good luck with your bad kids.
and then the other one was on the plot from the movie The Circle. Do you think it would be good for, I don't know if you've had a chance to see The Circle.
I started watching some of it, but I wasn't able to watch all of it in the time I had.
But I recommend it as a thought-provoking movie, and especially because in a lot of ways, we're moving in that direction. And at what point are we gonna say, well, no, let's not do this. Let's not have cameras in every room.
Who's
That's
watching and why?
with audio, you know,
Yeah.
you know, or carrying them around, you know, especially in the movie, I don't know if you saw, the politicians had to have cameras on them. So there's no more secret negotiations among politicians in making, you know, the laws and things. So they can't, like, be basically working for corporations that are bribing them, you know, to pass certain laws to benefit the corporations, because that would come out in a very open way so that everybody would know what was going on. So that's intriguing, because, you know, if you want your representative to actually be representing you, and whoever thinks that they really are, they're clearly being funded by their brother. I'm sorry, I'm referring to one particular candidate in our own bureaucracy, right? You know, who easily already has more money from his brother than any of the other candidates, you know. Sorry, I'm done, Levy. Should I mention him by name? No, I won't. I won't. However, that's kind of interesting. But we're going to pick up with the Republic today. And I suggested in my notes that you might read the introduction to it, because it explains, is it really the most important or most significant book of Plato's? I mean, that's tradition. Everyone says it is. My favorite line is that the Republic, along with the Bible, are the two most important books in the Western tradition. So that's kind of cool. But is it true? In fact, you know, even when we talk about the Bible, is the Bible that significant anymore? Actually, the Harry Potter books outsold the Bible a few years ago for the first time of any book outselling the Bible. So that's kind of interesting.
But do you think all Bible sales actually are done at bookstores? I know a lot of children are given them when they're confirmed, as well as there's like oddball stores.
Passed on by
Yeah.
parents.
I mean, not that, you know,
Yes, some of the Bibles I have were not new Bibles bought by people, but instead, you know, ones with like the family tree,
Yeah,
you know, so. But neither do I read those.
right.
You know.
I have a few, but, yeah.
I mean, and the ones that I do read, I don't write in, you know, with that sort of thing.
Yeah.
And in fact, I don't remember the last time I've read from an actual book copy of the Bible, because there's so many tools on the web to use that are just same. I mean, here's my Plato. You know, so I have my Plato, but you know what? I read this. Right. This is more accessible, actually. That, you know, where did you have that on the shelf? You know, that becomes a hard thing to remember where you last left it. You know, in a house full of books. You know, where the heck did I leave it? But I also think that Plato in general was so influential that you couldn't really just say that the Republic was like the book that was most influential. It might be the one that people think about the most. And there's aspects of it that seem remarkable in the way it's influenced actual government. And there are imitators, as this, you know, I was trying to remember when I think last week I even said, you know, that, or whenever, I've said this before, you know, that Cicero writes a version of the Republic, right? Augustine writes The City of God, which is his version basically of the Republic. Thomas More writes his Utopia, which in a sense is another. And then lots of other folks have written books that clearly have kind of echoed aspects of the Republic. So I'm rereading this because I suggested you read it, and as I read it, I see that's exactly what they say in this, and I'm thinking, is that where I got that? I don't know where I got this stuff.
Well, there's lots of arguments that Bible is the same as the Quran, is the same as I mean, that there's so many similarities in the stories. But,
Well, the Quran does use some sections of the Bible.
yeah, well,
The Quran was kind of Muhammad's favorite stories that he heard. He was actually in an oral tradition. He wasn't literate, as far as we know. His wife was, and theoretically, theoretically, he was behind the curtain, dictating to her what the angel told him. And I'm like hearing this story, and I'm thinking, boy, that sounds just like Joseph Smith too. You know, whoa, how come all these guys get this dictation from the divine and then have to give it to their wife through a curtain? At least Muhammad didn't use any dice to try to figure out the translation of the golden plates. But I know you normally don't call the Urim and the Thurim dice, but that's what they sound like to me. However, when we look at the importance of the book, there's no doubt that lots of people read it throughout history. And so even if you look at the book today and you say, this was really pretty dumb, we really know much better about the nature of human individuals, their psychology. This is perhaps the very beginning of an attempt to understand human psychology and these concepts. Now, I know that's a controversial argument in itself. Is this really the beginnings of, or the inventions of the concept of justice? I mentioned that to other people, and they say, oh no, I'm sure there was justice out there before Plato wrote this down, right? I mean, the Code of Hammurabi clearly was way before this. I've actually seen the Code of Hammurabi on a stela that is somehow a copy of the original. I don't know if it's fun to do or not, but I did make all these thinking that bigger than me. You notice I had to pan up with the camera. So here's, remember they use wedge cuneiform script on the, and it's on the back too. So you can see it. Is that interesting, being able to do that? That's, if you're ever in Philadelphia, this is at the University of Pennsylvania, the Museum of Art and Archaeology. And this is right as you come in the main door on the left side. So yeah, and those are laws. You could actually read translations of those laws. There's about 450 of them on there. And the one that I remember is, if you're a carpenter and you make a house for someone and it falls and it kills his wife, you owe him so much money. If it falls and kills his son, you owe him this much money, a little bit more, right? If it kills his daughter, well, you should give him something, And if it kills him, then you're like, so So it was very detailed, really, for considering how old that was. So there are laws and stuff. And the Republic doesn't give us laws, though. But if they're inventing the concept of justice and wisdom and temperance and courage, you know, the four virtues that it's discussing, morality in general, perhaps, right? Remember the thesis that Eric Havelock argues for in The Muse Learns to Write, that when Plato's writing, this is the beginning of prose, and this is the beginning then of a different kind of thinking that's not just like oral memory, which is primarily very concrete. I think of like native tales and stuff. You know. They don't talk about justice in the abstract in the native tales. They give you examples, concrete examples of how Coyote, you know, is sly or something, right? But now we actually have these ideas as concepts, and they're trying to figure out what they mean. They don't say what's the definition of it, but what is it, right? What is justice? And they come up with all these different uses for justice, and they try to figure out which one is right. So, you know, if that's right, then this is, of course, significant. This is a significant turning point, if that's correct, right? So it is significant, and even in this introduction, they talk about the way it's broken up into like chapters or books. That seems to be the first time that's happened. No, I mean, we're used to a book having chapters now, but when was the first time that some author wrote a book that had sections, right? And that seems to be this, right? And there's arguments over how the sections might have originally been arranged. Was it always the way it is now? Probably not. Who knows, right? So that's kind of interesting. But he's also trying to figure out human psychology. So there's a famous line about the Republic, that the Republic is man writ large. So it's just obviously kind of old English. Should be able to find of the state. In the individual writ large, obviously different translation. I don't know where these weird Quora. I don't know how I got into Quora or whatever. But writ large, just obviously weird. And so what does this mean? And so there's interpretations of the Republic that indicate that he's not just thinking in terms of the state, but of you yourself as kind of a state, right? And so when he's breaking the state up into three classes, social classes, the argument is that each person actually has these three classes, or three kind of parts to themselves. The physical part, that's primarily motivated by food, pleasure, the pleasures of the body and things of that sort. The spiritual side of us, which is meant in the sense of our social affections for others. So our spirit, in the sense of the Marine Corps, is free, right? That kind of spirit, where you want to protect the community, and you're glad to be praised by the community, right? That's not a physical pleasure as far as Plato's concerned. That's a spiritual reward, right? That you're being praised and honored. That we all give you a ticker tape parade or something, right? Hey, you won the Super Bowl, Well, and by the way, you also win money. But you know what? Theoretically, the joy of this kind of winning would have been the actual praise of the city cheering you for being. Here we go. I mean, we've got the Olympics going on, and as far as I know, oh yeah, okay, if they win, they're going to probably get their picture on a box of Kellogg's Sugar Flakes or something, and probably there's some money in that, and there's probably some money if you're a winner, and so on. But you know, theoretically, the real honor is standing there for your country on the podium with the ribbon and having the not the alma mater. What's it called?
Yeah.
Our national anthem. Yeah. Clay. Alma mater. Where'd that come from? Sorry. I'm not tired. I'm fine. Plenty of rest today. So that's one way of thinking about what this is, you know, that the state or the republic is man writ large. It's in a sense possible to interpret what he's doing as saying this isn't only the way the state ideally should be structured, but it's also a representation of a human psychology. And that's easily going to match, because he's going to give us these different classes of society that we, you know, oh yeah, I'm there, I like pizza, you know, I like a glass of wine, you know, occasionally. I'm not a connoisseur. You know, when they come and they say, would you like to try the wines? You know, I'm like, I'm sure it's fine. You know, and I can't tell the difference, you know, anyway. You know. But back to a really embarrassing story. The very first time my wife and I went to dinner before we were married, we were dating, and we went to the Brownstone restaurant in Chester County. I don't know if you're familiar with it. So we go to this restaurant and we ordered some wine, and they you know, she brought the bottle and she started to pour it into my glass, and as she started to pour, she started to spill it, so she stopped. And she said to me, would you like to try it, sir? And I said, sure. So I took the bottle and I poured it without spilling anything. And Donna looked at me and went, I think she meant, would you like to try the wine, Bill? And then, oh, yeah. She still married me. What can I say? So that has nothing to do with Plato. Okay. But yeah, we all have that part of ourselves that he refers to as iron or bronze. He has metals, and so he refers to metals. So the working metals, iron and bronze, are associated with the lower class. The middle class, not as in income, but the middle class is the spirited group, and those are the ones that primarily seek rewards spiritually through the honors of the state. So those are the individuals that sacrifice themselves by being in the militia or the military, the police, fire department, volunteer fire department, right? You know, you're just doing it for the social honor of knowing you're helping your community. But then the other class, the golden, so that class is the silver medal, but then the golden class is the wisdom folks, right? And those are the ones that are primarily motivated by knowledge itself. What we might and still think of, you know, higher education is not so that you can get a good job. Higher education's reward is learning itself, the reward of knowing, right? And those folks that like knowing are also the ones that know or understand and can rule. And so they're the ones that are the gold class, and their virtue is wisdom, right? So we end up with these three different social classes The lower class is the working folks. They're rewarded primarily by the material rewards of life. And so temperance is their virtue, because they need to know how much of a good thing they ought to have. You know, not too much pizza, not too little. You know, how to share, basically. And an important part of these, because these are the ones that actually make all the wealth of the state, as he imagines it. They make all the wealth of the state. They make all the, you know, the industries and everything. So they have all the stuff. So they have all the property. They're the only ones that have property. But they're the ones that have to share it with others in order for the state to flourish. Right? And so they have to have temperance. They have to be willing to share a certain amount of the property that they've made, so that everyone else can do their share of the state. Right? You've got to share with the police. The police are doing a good job. They're trying to protect us, and they're doing it basically because they want to. They feel the need and they want to do that, but at the same time, you're reaping the benefit of their being the police and doing that, right? You're not out endangering your life every night, you know, making sure that the city is being protected and everything. But they need to thrive, so you're going to have to share your wealth with them so that they can have a life, right? As we'll see, though, it's pretty odd. He's not suggesting that they have families. And that's kind of confusing, because on the other hand, it seems like they should also have their wives in common. So it's not like they have their own personal family, but on the other hand, they kind of live like in dormitories, almost like the military. But nonetheless, they have wives in common. And in fact, their wives can also be in that social class. They should be in that social class. So this is like the definition of elitism. That there are social classes, that you're born to your social class. That remember when we were talking about the Mano, the idea that you can't really change a person. They have their characteristics. This is all Plato, right? So the individual is really there, and yet at the same time you can educate them. But what's going to happen as you educate them is they're just going to become more the way they are, right? So they're already pretty set in their ways, but you're going to enable them to flourish as the kind of person that they are, right? So you're still educating them, but you're not really going to change their actual character. It's his psychology, right? Remember, that's because your soul is already who you are, right? And how do you explain why some individuals have one kind of soul and others a different kind of soul? That sounds really strange too. And the only thing I can get out of it is that, well, some individuals get more of a balance of soul or body, right? So that those that have more body and less soul tend to be in the iron and bronze class, right? They're the workers. They're the ones that are primarily motivated by pleasure and things of that sort, physical pleasure, right? But spiritual pleasure, that would be those that have kind of a balance. And then the wisdom seekers are the ones that have mostly soul. They could they could fast. By the way, it's not something that he encourages. Fasting comes later. So the idea of like the ascetic life that you see in the religious orders, where you're supposed to actually mutilate your body, to discipline it, whip your body, to make sure that you're in charge. Starve yourself. Live in a cave. Be out in the cold. The heat. Do without. That kind of self-torture, self-flagellation, whipping yourself. A lot of folks, even today on holidays, whole groups of men will walk down the streets whipping themselves. I'm sure you've seen pictures of this, and bleeding. I mean, it's not like they're just fake smacking themselves. They're actually scarring themselves on the, on the back, to show that they're beating their, because it's the old rule, spare the rod, spoil the child, right? So if you want your children to grow up so that they have discipline, you have to beat them so that they grow up and learn, to beat themselves as well as their children, right? That's not considered appropriate today by a lot of people. And yet there are, Dr. Dobson, dare to parent or dare to, what's Dobson's, what's his favorite, dare to discipline. Basically, this is encouragement to beat the crap out of your child so that they behave. Is that fair to say? Are any of you fond of Dr. Dobson? There's lots of folks out there. He's a minister. So the doctor comes from being a doctor of ministry, not child psychology. But that doesn't go to Plato. So we don't see Plato encouraging people to beat the crap out of themselves in order to have more discipline, to have the body discipline to the soul. Right? That will come later. In fact, we might even blame that on Paul, St. Paul. I don't know. If you're familiar with St. Paul, the letters of St. Paul, epistles, right? St. Paul. But could be John the Baptist. John the Baptist obviously was an ascetic, right? Right? You guys know John the Baptist. Doesn't have a head anymore. You're all familiar with that story, right? Mm-hmm. Salome wanted the head. Yes? Actually have it on video.
I want the head of the Baptist.
Okay, so maybe we won't see the head in this one.
King Herod used
Forget it. If you're interested, though, in being horrified, there's an opera by Richard Strauss called Salome, where Salome famously does the dance of the seven veils. You've all heard of that one? Mm-hmm. Yes? Beautiful music. So she, of course, has been asked by stepdad, Herod Antipas, to dance for him, and he would give her up to half of his kingdom if she did. Herodias, her mom, says no, don't do it, but Salome does. Actually, in the biblical version, Herodias says, yeah, go do it. Because she wants her to ask for the head, because she's the one that really wants the head. But in Strauss, who's kind of Freudian, the reason Salome asks for the head is because she wants to kiss John the Baptist, and he keeps refusing to let her kiss him. So she gets the head, and then in the end of the opera, she's kissing this severed, bloody head, usually in a white gown. I was looking for it, somewhere. You get the idea. But I don't see, that's really quite gruesome. However, you could find it yourself and just watch it. The music is absolutely gorgeous. But of course, here's beautiful music where she's having a duet, singing to a head. So this is quite un-American, very European. To have this, blood dripping down the white gown, as you can, great, dramatic visual. And the music is absolutely out of this world. And of course, right at that point, Herod yells from the side. It's in German, so he yells from the side to kill that horrible woman. And his soldiers come with shields and they crush her. And none of that's biblically true, or in the Bible. Right? But Strauss, of course, what's it called? Artistic freedom or whatever. How did I get into that? I don't know. It's just really fantastic art, anyway. That sounds like John the Baptist, though, I think. So that's weird that that must be his prison, I guess. And she's down there trying to get him to kiss her. He doesn't. So, so I don't know where the aestheticism comes into a European culture or other cultures. It's not just European, is it? There are monks of that sort. Buddhist monks certainly do that. In fact, the interesting thing is Buddha, who's just about the same time as Socrates, but obviously in India. Master Kung, or Kung Fu Tzu, about the same time as both of them, are, so this is Socrates, right? So that's not contemporary of Jesus. But at about the same time, they all run into conflict with the local priesthood. So Buddha, for example, tries all the religions, that's the Hindu religions, and realizes by sitting under the enlightenment tree, the Bodha tree, right, that all of those religions are wrong, and he becomes enlightened, and instead now starts the Buddhism, right? And the main thing is you follow the Eightfold Path, each of which is right thoughts, right practices, right, each of them are right something, right? And what it basically means is learning how to live without attachment to stuff, to pleasures, right? So it's the aesthetic motif that your soul is kind of trapped in this physical body, but the soul hates the physical side of things and wants to be separate from it. And the way to kind of wean your soul out of this situation is to stop allowing your body with your soul to enjoy the things in life. Right? So basically starving yourself and getting total control over the body enables that soul then to basically escape that attachment to the physical world. Right? So at death, then your soul basically can escape the dilemma and not be forced back into the meat, reincarnation, right? Right. So that's the Buddhist kind of back to the meat, you know. And you see that same thing with monks in the West, and the same rationale, that it's the soul that's important, and the soul hates all this physical stuff, right? And so how do you deal with that? You know, because on the one hand, your body is like the vehicle that your soul has to live in, and as a result, the body wants to eat. It's really persistent. It wants to eat. If you don't eat, you know, you collapse. You know, you've got to, or you can't keep going, right? And you know, there's other persistent demands that the body puts on you too. But all of those things are attachments to the physical, which is corruption, sinful. So that's kind of interesting. But I don't see in Plato, I don't see any insistence on disciplining the body. Instead, there's this actual worship of Eros as the first god. Remember the symposium, right? When they're trying to define God, Eros is the earliest of the gods. And the demi-urge, or the demi-urge, right? It's kind of like the almost a divine urge of creation, is part of this physical world. So Plato doesn't seem to be an ascetic to me. So that, I think, you know, comes into the philosophy later, right? There's the element, I mean, we could see that the interesting argument is that John the Baptist is actually a follower of Socrates. It's weird, isn't it? How does that happen? That comes from Mr. Robert Funk. He's one of the members of the Jesus Seminar. And so you've got roughly 700 scholars that come together every couple of years. They're members of the Jesus Seminar. They're comparing their work each year, each time they come together to see how their research is doing and everything. Meanwhile, they also write books and so on. And, Robert Funk, who's one of the leaders of the group, in this book, Honest to Jesus, argues that Socrates, being the kind of person he was, had followers that basically led to what we refer to as the Cynics, which is the dog philosophy, basically. We'll talk about them as we go. And that John the Baptist has all the signs of being a cynic because of the way he lives and everything. And that Jesus, by the way, obviously even in the Bible, coming to John and being baptized at the River Jordan, if you remember that story too, in that sense, it's clear that Jesus has some connection to John, but Robert Funk then will argue that Jesus in that sense is a follower of John, and John is an ascetic. But Jesus' mission, by the way, starts once John is imprisoned by Herod, and of course we know about the head thing, right? So he doesn't live much longer after that. And Jesus then sort of continues on the mission of John. So his interesting argument is that Jesus is basically a cynic. So if you're honest to Jesus and not read Paul into Jesus, you end up realizing that Jesus' philosophy is a cynic philosophy. So that's kind of interesting. I forget if I asked in my test, one of the quiz questions, or one of the test questions that you could answer is compare Jesus and Socrates. And that's one of the approaches you might take in comparing them is his argument that Jesus in one respect might be considered kind of a follower of Socrates. So that's interesting. Or not, depending on your point of view. Okay, so let's talk about the triangle or pyramid, I suppose. Am I boring you guys, or are we okay? Ooh, which pyramid am I gonna get? Uh-oh. That's not the one I want. This is not the one I was looking for, but since it's here, let me discuss this real quick. Plato was probably a Pythagorean, arguably. Who influenced him? Pythagoras. And one of the things about Pythagoras, if you recall, Pythagoras believed that the arche of everything was number, and that if you have one has a certain shape to it, two has a certain shape that's a little bit two-dimensional, 3 dimensions fire, 4 dimensions earth. Plato, being a mathematician and loving math, discovers that we can have these different kinds of shapes that are the ideal shapes besides the circle. These are ideal in the sense that they can have equal numbers of faces. And as far as I know, these are the only ones. So you can have, it says we have an animation. Do you think that would work? I bet it doesn't. Oh, it does. Wow. But you didn't need that. You get the idea, right? All the faces of a tetrahedron are the same. Same thing with a cube, or 8 faces. Or 12. And the highest number, 20. What would that be? Icosahedron. Interesting. So what does this mean? Plato might have thought that because of that, these are the shapes that basically make up the different elements. They also use these to try to design the orbits of the various objects in space that go around the Earth, thinking that if you nest these inside of one another, and then the largest one would be the circle on the outside of it. Copernicus tried to do this. Before he came up with the Earth orbiting the Sun, he kept trying to figure out how all these could be nested into one another. Which model is this? Oh, I didn't want that one. Nope. Shoot. Well, I have seen if you've ever seen it, have you ever seen like all the different orbits all nested into one another in like a wooden model? before they started figuring out that the Earth couldn't be in the center. That was, they're trying to use these shapes to represent the orbits of them. But the pyramid that I wanted to show, let me try instead of I'll try the triangle. No, that's not the one I want. How come I'm having trouble to triangle instead? Now I'm just totally stuck in the solids. Let's go to this. So this is Maslow. This is more contemporary. For Plato, if you imagine this, we've only got three. So 1, 2, 3. Usually the bottom is the much bigger one because of the way a pyramid or triangle is shaped. Right? So the bottom for Plato would be the iron class or the bronze class, the metals. All the working metals for that class. The middle would be the spirited class, the silver, and then the top would be the gold. The virtue of the ruling class, the gold class, would be wisdom. The virtue of the middle class, this one in the center, right, would be courage. And the virtue of the bottom class is temperance. I kind of mentioned that, right? All of us have all of these characteristics, but we do have individuals that primarily want to learn, others that want to defend, others that just are too interested in making things, basically. This is Plato. Now, so what he's essentially doing, I think, is looking at his society and seeing this mix in society. Now remember, Athens at the time was a slave culture. Most people in the town were slaves or were owned by the wealthier people, the property owning classes. Women not allowed to participate in governments, not educated, although there were of course educated women, but it wasn't like a priority. They were expected to do housework of some sort. I don't know exactly what. The wealthy classes then, their main reason for being educated was primarily so that they can engage in politics, debate, win, outsmart others, and so on. But there was also, of course, the interest in the military, because every city fought every other city, pretty much. Right? Lots of history of that. And in fact, during Socrates' time and Plato's childhood, Athens lost to Sparta, right? So you're probably all familiar with that. Lots of dumb reasons why Athens did that. They thought because they were a sea power, they should only fight by sea. But of course, the city's on land, so they had a wall. The Spartans couldn't get through the wall. And they did have a wall all the way to their nearest port, so they were protected so that they could keep getting supplies and everything. But they also got disease, and so plague essentially affected them because they were under siege for about 2 years by the Spartans. The Spartans had a stronger army. Remember, the Spartans lived in a society that was not democratic, totally different. They had wives in common, basically. And the men never lived with the wives. They lived in like barracks. They had a military life. Every morning they had to get up and do calisthenics, get out there, drill sergeant yelling at them kind of thing, all that sort of thing, I guess. So when we think of boy, this is a really Spartan environment, not much, in the house that's associated with that kind, right? Everybody knows that. Sparta imposed a democracy, or imposed a government on Athens when Athens lost, and it was the period of the 30 tyrants. They picked 30 people to rule Athens to make sure that they got rid of all the Democrats. Within a couple of years, though, that Athens did revolt against them, and they ended up with another democracy, but not for long. So even though we hail Athens as the beginning of democracy, it was a terrible democracy. Not everybody had freedom. Not that many people were involved in it, roughly 500 at a time, basically. All the people that were at Socrates' trial, basically, were all the ones with property that could vote, right? So not really an ideal democracy in any respect, as far as we would compare it today. And by the way, that's not really when they had their peak. The golden age of Greece was Pericles, and Pericles, I'm not sure that he would be considered a Democrat. Well, I guess he was. But remember, he died in the plague with Sparta, as well as many others in the town. So his funeral oration was, remember, the one that we had as a first reading from the Thucydides text. It wasn't his funeral, it was him giving the speech at a funeral of a lot of heroes, but nonetheless he eventually would die from the plague himself. So we use this pyramid to represent the basic, this is Maslow. By the way, notice, absolutely, Maslow is copying Plato. So even though this is a contemporary model, relatively speaking, what Maslow was the 80s, 1970s, Maslow was big. Notice that it's the same kinds of characteristics. So you've got to have your food and water and shelter, right? You've got to have safety, security. You've got to feel like you belong. So that would go right in with about the same place in Plato's triangle. Esteem, that's part of that those spiritual needs too. And self-actualization, feeling, that all of that fits beautifully with a kind of a modern interpretation of Plato's triangle, essentially. Also so how does the Republic start off? It's kind of literature, so everybody shows up and they're, oh, hello, etc. So-and-so's been off shopping, and now, no, not really. But, we're back. Let's have a discussion about justice. Okay, can we, do we know what justice is? Oh, I don't think so. What is justice? And so we start talking about it. And you get a first definition. The first definition is interest of the stronger. I think I mentioned this last week, right? The interest of the stronger. And that's, I think I used the idea of the Allies judging the Nazis, right? So it's not that the big brute basically gets his way. It's that the biggest brute imposes his view of justice on everyone else. So the Americans basically imposed a view of justice on the Nazis after World War II. But so the interest of the stronger. But there's a criticism of the interest of the stronger, and that's because if a society really tried to live that way, you would end up with everyone else being upset, and you'd eventually end up with a revolt. right? So that really doesn't work out. And the argument against this, you might not feel like it really works, but they use the ring of Gyges, which is an interesting narrative. If you're familiar with the Lord of the Rings, the Ring of Power. I mean, how many powerful rings are there in the world? You know, it's just like, wow, everyone has their own ring of power story. But this one is, of course, much older, and it's a myth that Plato's using. It doesn't seem like it's a myth he creates. It's one that they would have all been familiar with. And this is a ring that Gyges finds, and he discovers that when he puts it on his hand, he's invisible. People don't see him, and he starts saying, "My precious." No, sorry, that's not this story. And he starts living longer. No, that's still not this story. But he ends up realizing, since he's invisible, he can get away with murder. Really, because he does, of course, kills the king and takes over, the kingdom. But this doesn't really work out well in the end. So that's pretty, a pretty good story of how. I mean, because it's evil. It's actually evil, and you can't run a kingdom based on something stupid like that. So that's kind of interesting. So interest of the stronger, that kind of goes by. Next definition is tell the truth and pay your debts. Tell the truth and pay your debts. That's justice. Clearly another use of the concept. That's a good moral point of view. You should tell the truth. Honesty, really important. And paying your debts is part of that. But they come up with the concept of the white lie, right? And part of it is kind of like, the guy gives you his armor and says, "When I come back, give me my armor." Okay, it's his armor. You're just watching it for him. And he goes off, and of course he gets drunk at what's the name of the bar?
Ale House?
Well, that's the one here. I'm thinking of the one downtown where.
I mean, a lot of bars have.
The Gaslight.
I can't think of the one that, it's on the corner of Old Seward. No, it's Bernard. Coots. Coots. I don't know. I'm thinking of Coots, right? I think that's where my son goes, and gets beat up or whatever. But Coots. So he goes to Coots, gets drunk, comes back, and he's pissed off at somebody else, and he wants his armor back. And you, being a good friend, you know that this isn't going to be good for anybody. So you don't give the armor back to him for his own safety. But that's a lie. That's a white lie, a fib, right? Say, for example, like instead of armor, right, it's his keys, right? He goes to Coots, gives you the keys. If I'm drunk, don't give me the keys back, right? Because you don't want your friend driving drunk. It's bad for everybody. But of course, he comes back drunk, and he won't give me the keys. And I don't have them. You're lying, but you're lying for his benefit. What do you think? Is this okay? Everybody agrees? They do too. So they're convinced telling the truth is not just all the time. There are occasions when it isn't, and so that can't be justice. Same thing with paying your debts, because you're not going to give them the keys back. Right? So that one goes by. And they get to give each his own. Give each his own. Well, now that's where it gets into the psychology. Because what they essentially realize is what each individual wants what's right for him. And each of us has a different psychology, right? Some of us want physical things, some of us want spiritual benefits, some of us want to learn, have wisdom, right? So they use that to build the reason why the state needs these three, or has these three classes of people. And what is just is the social arrangement that enables each of those social classes to get what they want. So that's why the society is structured that way, so that each of these classes can be in their proper place. Now the question is, how do you figure out who goes to what place, right? Because all of us have all these characteristics. So Plato comes up with an outrageous idea. All the children, as soon as they're weaned, should be taken away from their parents and raised together by people who don't know whose parents which children go with, right? So basically they're anonymous. Every kid ends up being treated the same. Because if you knew that this was so-and-so, Donald Trump's son, you would probably give him special favors so that, how that works. Well, no, if you don't know whose kids they are, you can't give any of them special favors. You treat them all the same. But what happens then is they end up growing and liking certain things, and then you let them basically weed themselves out by merit, basically. Who likes to do this? They do that. Who likes to do this? They do that. Who likes to do this? They do that. Of course, everybody gets to eventually end up in the opportunity to have certain military service, but only the ones that really like it are the ones that stay in it. And as they get older, those who are more interested in learning are the ones that graduate into the wisdom class. So everyone kind of comes from that. By the way, Plato doesn't think you should study philosophy too soon. Because if you do, you'll become a problem for authority, right? Look what happened to Socrates. So it's kind of interesting because Socrates, we know, thought you should study philosophy as soon as you can, and that's good for you. And then you become a critical thinker and you become an asshole like him, right? So Plato learned from this, apparently, and realized, well, we don't want kids learning this kind of stuff because then you'll question authority and they won't do what they're supposed to. So we don't teach them this kind of stuff until they're old enough that they're basically done. Now they're in their 50s, now they can study philosophy. And now they can become the philosophers that then will rule the guardians. The guardians who will, because of their knowledge, they're not getting rewarded for this, but they know best, and they're the ones that can make the decisions that run the government, basically. So that's Plato, right? Now, along with this, we get nestled in the book is his description of knowledge. And we can think of this in the Theaetetus also. And the question is, what is knowledge? In the Theaetetus, they don't really come to a good conclusion. In the Republic, they seem to. And so we get this divided line theory. It says, this is the visible realm. This is visible. Visible is what you actually physically see, right? And in that visible realm, we have dreams. Now you might think, wait a minute, I'm not actually seeing that, that's a dream. But in your dream, you're seeing it. And I'm also aware of phantasms, illusions. I see those, right? If I'm crawling in the desert, dying of thirst, and I see a Pepsi machine, right? And I start crawling towards the Pepsi machine. Saved, and I get up to the Pepsi machine and I realize it was just a mirage. It's actually a Coke machine. So I'm all disappointed, and I keep crawling off into the day. Maybe it was the other way, I forget, either way. Depending on whether you're a fan of Coke or Pepsi. A mirage. You know, seeing water in the road in Arizona. You know, and then you get there, of course, and this, and even when you pull over and there's a water fountain and you step on it, it goes. Nothing ever comes out of it, right? You know, it's Arizona. It's a myth. They don't have water there. You know, you drive over streams. No, there's no stream there. You know, it's like, yes, I'm kidding. They get water 2 days a year.
Yeah, well, no, more than that.
More than that. And when it does, you better get out of the
Say
way.
things like that, Mr. Jamison, because people who've never been there will think that's true.
Oh my goodness. Do you think they did?
It's possible.
Okay. Don't stand in those wadis or whatever they're called, because a moment's notice, you know, whoosh, you know, then your car is upside down. Yeah, remember, nothing I say in class should be taken for granted is right.
Well,
I'm too old to actually remember anything, so. These are all skits that I've had memorized, you know, that I just put the needle on the record, and that's why you hear static every once in a while. I apologize. Arizona's a beautiful state. And my son just graduated from Arizona State University, so not the same one that gets beat up at Coots. That's the other one. Within our own family, we have haves and have-nots. What can you say? Okay. So, things like phantasms, dreams, hallucinations, all that kind of stuff. You're actually seeing that stuff, but you can't trust it. In fact, as the case with the Pepsi machine, clearly it's not even a Pepsi machine. It's a Coke machine. Or no water at all, right? Whatever, right? So it's an illusion. On the other hand, this is my copy of Plato's works. I feel really pretty certain about that. Plato would critique me, though, and point out that, you know, that's not true knowledge. That's belief. I kind of believe that that's the case. I have grounds for believing it, but, you know, I can't really absolutely know it for sure, because how do I know that this isn't a dream? I might be dreaming. How do you know the difference between dreams and reality, right? In fact, for Plato, what we think of as reality is kind of a dream in the first place, right? So everything that's in the visible realm is merely opinion, not true knowledge. Now, if I come over here now, what kinds of things are abstract, so I can't see them? Triangularity. I know triangles are a three-sided figure. That is true, and knowing that is knowledge. Same thing with a circle, same thing with adding 1 + 1 = 2. You know, a lot of the things that we would have in math, they didn't have decimals, didn't really have fractions as far as I understand it, and yet they figured out pi, so I don't know how that worked. You don't have decimals and you don't have fractions, how do you get pi? I don't know. But then, you know, you could go study Greek math from then. It's very puzzling. Keep in mind they didn't have numbers. So alpha was 1, beta was 2, delta was 3. Delta, gamma, alpha, beta, gamma, delta is 4. That's that, right? You know, so iota is 10. So, you know, and then from there on it goes up by like 20, 30, 40, right? So, does that make it a decimal system? I'm not really sure if you would call it a decimal system. Maybe, right? You know, there are other systems besides decimal systems, right? The Babylonian number system was base 60. Yes? So you go up, so this is really weird stuff, but. Right, so you go up to 60 is the next one. Where do you pick up 60? Does it show? Where it is. You get the idea. Instead of 1 to 10, you have 1 to 60 in their system before you repeat everything. Does that make sense? Should we take a break? You guys having fun? Is this interesting? Am I doing what you paid for, or I worry about all that? Of
Wanna give us
course.
a quiz question?
I should give you a quiz question. Why are there 12 months? Why are there 12 months? Good question.